This recording is slightly troubling because I've thought a bit too much about how to develop this argument, and it's gone so far that I might not get the flow of essentially the subject matter. So where to start? I guess I want to get into the crux of what I consider to be the kind of the cultural paradox of identity politics, which we must understand sort of as a kind of cultural ontology centers around feminism and, to be more precise, centers around a certain section of the female population, which are still dependent or tethered into um, a kind of cultural exploitation, which feminism has never taken proper ownership of. They have, and essentially they have disempowered themselves because they've taken that cultural those cultural conventions, that sort of that sacred cow of feminine um, virtue, and they don't like paying, let's say, the double edged price or cost of that, which then they'll sort of externalize the accountability thereof and have this kind of external locus of control, which they call the patriarchy. And I mean, maybe what I'm going to go into is essentially the patriarchy to some degree, but it doesn't matter what you label it. And in some sense, I think that it's more accurately described as a kind of insidious matriarchy. It doesn't matter what you call it, it matters that you understand how it's actually functioning and how it operates, and how this is effectively a somewhat of a self inflicted cultural injury in terms of at least tracking feminism. Now, the biggest problem with this is that these complaints against feminism, or at least in its current instantiation of feminism, but in terms of this cultural exploitation that women utilize, which some feminists will say in this weird, convoluted, sort of two-faced way that yes, many women are duped into their patriarchal sort of function or role or something like that, um, and how they relate to things, but that whole ideological narrative has baked within it this external locus of control and uh, perpetrates the very same formulaic complaint which is levied against this kind of this vague systemic oppression. You know, always this weird nebulous boogeyman that is used to kind of fill in the gap of the narrative, which is just essentially more. Uh, this really this issue is really most vividly understood when you understand personality disorders, specifically borderline personality disorder, um, which the ideology of identity politics is uh, functionally a facsimile thereof. So you have this idea that so the notion of systemic oppression is very similar to what I think is mislabeled in terms of the current thinking on borderline personality disorder, which describes something called alloplastic defenses, which is something like um, the borderline will protect themselves by essentially selectively editing their interpretation of reality, by essentially confabulating reality in order to confirm their basic beliefs, which require them to be um, attached to somebody else's feelings so that they can essentially export and exhibit their stream of consciousness, their emotional subjective stream of consciousness, and somebody else is on the hook to pandering to their emotions or reacting to their emotions, that somebody else needs to be subjected to them. And via that kind of codependency, this kind of parasitic emotional attachment, um, they can essentially keep their subjective emotions in this kind of infallible state. They can essentially always have these sort of these heralding sort of waves of a unilateral feeling, and they're essentially never wrong, even as they might jettison and um, cut themselves off from their prior um, exhibitions. You know, they can constantly uh, uh, sort of be cobbling together a new social mask, a new valence, a new identity that's always sort of renewed in the moment. That's just this kind of ad hoc um, litany that is always this kind of dominant central axle to the narrative. They're always sort of in the center of the universe, narrating what's going on around them. So they have this kind of this unilateral, dictatorial kind of relationship to reality. But what facilitates that kind of what I really think it is it's a form of psychopathy, because they the biggest problem with treating borderline personality disorder is essentially when you label this kind of strategy as an alloplastic defense, what you're really doing is you're saying these people are so pathological, they're so self deluded that they don't know what it is that they're doing, they don't know what it is that they're orchestrating, they're not sentient, they're not accountable. And essentially, because you don't hold them accountable for deploying this strategy of this kind of this parasitic emotional bond, and because I mean that bond is not just a kind of automatic sort of reflexive thing. It's something that requires quite a lot quite a lot of detailed, exploitative, pre-selected, you know, sort of manipulation and machination. There's a lot of reasoning that goes into. I mean, it's very covert, that reasoning. It's not. It's somewhat the subtext of the emotional litany and the exhibitionism that's constantly happening. So there's this whole sort of subterranean. I've described it as the chess playing demon, as I've described borderline as basically not being a secondary psychopath, but being a very sophisticated form of essentially just a kind of a female um, expression of psychopathy. Um, anyway, what you label it is not really that important, but now I think that this culturally entrenched, you know, sort of facility that some section of the female population has learned to operate and has created cultural conventions in order to entrench using these kinds of powers. I mean, you can kind of, I mean, you can try to come up with a kind of evolutionary sort of psychological explanation uh, that, well, women are always, or generally speaking, physically um, inferior to the upper body strength that men have, and therefore the only way that they would be able to kind of exert um, being able to kind of enforce their preferences or something like that is by kind of reframing reality and culture in as much as asserting things directly. Um, I don't really buy this that well. I mean, I think that there are a whole other sort of there are a whole other array of elements that I think are much more likely to lead to this kind of development in culture, uh, which generally all have to do with the innate value that women have to the group, which is higher than generally the innate value that men have. That men are necessary, but women are somewhat much more sufficiently embody a form of kind of biological capital in terms of a pro-social kind, and essentially women have just found a way to, in a much more secured fashion, sort of trade on that currency and to exert that, but it comes with a kind of a cost attached to it, which is that you have to kind of entrench cultural conventions. You have to kind of operate as a block. You have to kind of create a consolidated um, conformity, and so the kind of the price of female non-conformity uh, is in a completely different sort of cultural scale to the non-conformity which is almost expected of males to distinguish themselves and to take risks and to try to accrue social status and social standing and other forms uh, uh, token cultural power that they can essentially use in order to pay women to associate with them, um, and to offer them their biological capital, as it were. And so it's a kind of, the general sort of things of hypergamy, are basically, I think, what the general structure of hypergamy describes, I think, the development of this kind of cultural these kinds of these cultural conventions and relations are. But anyway, it this, just because this exists doesn't mean that this is the only thing that exists. There are also women who don't operate under those structures, and essentially they have always been more independently minded. But essentially, and there's also a kind of there's a sophistication that some women can do very well, which is basically that they compartmentalize how they operate within society, where they know how to essentially um, conduct elements of both uh, in a seemingly in an integral way, in a way that sort of um, plays into that kind of uh, uh, it's kind of like a game that they are playing, but they don't believe the game, but they are sort of playing it as a kind of as well that's a conventional game that regulates mate selection and regulates uh, romance, or something like that. Um, and so they kind of they engage in it in a kind of transcendental sense, and so they're able to sort of to just use it as a meeting place, as a point of departure, as a meeting point, essentially, because so it's just a kind of it's a cultural edifice. But it doesn't dictate their their internal locus of control and their internal sense of what's really going to be behind when they decide to form a pair bond, or whatever. Um, okay, so in some sense, it's kind of it's almost like a cultural evolutionary, sort of residue that as a society and as people that have vastly, I mean, the biggest variant within human population is intelligence. We have a huge spectrum of intelligence. I mean, intelligence is one of those things where it's kind of crazy because, if you just related it to height, generally speaking, um, someone who's the tallest person in 1,000 people and someone who is the shortest person within 1,000 people, are like are both visually understood to look like members of the same species. But if you converted IQ points into height, and then you visually looked at society, it starts to look a bit crazy. It starts to look like, what's going on here. And that hidden layer, let's just say, of variance within population is, and then you put in this kind of this traditional, um, these cultural residues, um, and you start getting, a kind of a minefield. And uh, this has come to a head, especially in terms of identity politics and feminism. And it still is unclear how this can be culturally brokered. I mean, the Romans somewhat understood these issues as a kind of as just a matter of fact, and their legal system um, just was cognizant of this, essentially, that essentially women were just regarded as being minors, essentially as being legal minors. They could not sort of be held responsible legally for their actions, generally speaking, or at least their responsibility was vested in the paterfamilias. So essentially the paterfamilias was responsible for their actions, and they were uh, like the children of the head of the household. So there was this kind of this perpetual minority. Um, and I would say that is a kind of that is a cultural. Um, I mean, you can call it a kind of um, that is a cultural brokering of essentially of creating a firewall to protect. Uh, I mean, for example, I mean the examples of this all over the place. In the Islamic legal system, you have to have five women to sort of equal the testimony of one man. Um, there is this idea essentially that essentially because of this presumption um, of the propensity of women of engaging in this kind of in this moral system where they have this external locus of control. Um, and that because they are trading on this kind of on this cultural convention in the sacred cow that women are just naturally have virtue, have a kind of have an innocence, um, that once you have kind of operated in that worldview, essentially leveraging your identity as a kind of as a supplementary source of integrity, that you don't have quite the same level of rooted um, or grounded uh, uh, weight that is attached uh, to tracking reality to any sort of high degree of fidelity, or in a way that hinges on your integrity, because you don't, in a sense, operate from a level of integrity. You operate from a level of your identity, which is essentially asserted or essentially just assumed to have a kind of innocence. And so you can't operate that vehicle of identity, which is a kind of uh, I should have mentioned this earlier as well when I was talking about the ideology, that essentially your when you're trying to leverage an identity, which is basically the cover or the guise of a parasitic belief system that attaches yourself to an external authority, that you are um, able essentially to reframe displeasure and discomfort into a narrative of how essentially your external locus of control um, was deficient in supplying you with what would be called in borderline essentially okay, this is grammatically what I'm about to say is grammatically incorrect, but you know what I mean. But what is called in borderline the alloplastic defense. So it's like if if it isn't already sort of delivered by the external locus of control, then it isn't reinterpreted in line with what in borderline is called an alloplastic defense, which makes a lot more sense when I describe it as a strategy of alloplasticity. Now, this has to sort of culture. The only way I think to get through this and to have a culture in which we can have emancipated women, sadly, we have to come to a kind of the only way that we're going to make real progress is if we come to the kind of the cultural watershed that yes, there is a section of the female population. I mean, there's also a very tiny section of the male population which also have borderline personality disorders, but it should also be understood that male borderlines often have a slightly different manifestation, but it's I mean I'll say it's just as toxic, but it's interesting that male borderlines often exemplify a higher level of internal locus of control, that they have to shape their narrative much more cunningly, much more craftily. It's quite interesting, but anyway, that essentially they have to have a semblance of trying to have an internal locus of control, which then was uh, um, foiled by some devious, insidious external locus of control. They have to actually make a much more concerted effort at concocting a drama in which their internal locus of control was ostensibly subverted. And they have to kind of manage that on a kind of Machiavellian drama. But it's interesting in seeing the difference that essentially that when borderline manifests as in a male, essentially you can understand that the starting point of the development of the borderline pathology is that it exploits cultural conventions, is that it takes the current image um, of gender, as being a kind of as being quite a prominent cultural sort of pantheon of archetype and such, and it because I mean if you're going to create a kind of a vortex in which you can try to compel other people to give you the space to work your kind of your parasitic belief system, you have to engage in cultural objects which are shared, which are already kind of you have to use buttons which everyone has, so that when you are using those buttons, you're pushing everyone's sort of you're tapping into everybody else's interpretation of reality simultaneously. And so, you need a very strong bank of cultural conventions to even have a kind of successful um, kind of borderline manifestation, which is also why I quite like the decadence of the identity politics, because it is actually revealing to people the inner workings of psychology and culture, in essentially that it's quite a translucent bag of insanity, in that it is revealing to people just how internally self-deluding and sort of and deranged, and it really puts I mean, to me, it's important because essentially it's the anatomy of fascism. The idea that you're going to essentially extract self-esteem parasitically um, via an ideologically regulated narrative uh, uh, that is feeding your identity, and so your identity is essentially the source of your narcissistic supply. Um, but the narrative is important because the narrative has to essentially set up your identity as as a kind of as a program of vulnerable narcissism that essentially it kind of bestows the identity with a kind of narcissistic injury, um, which then is kind of like a tripwire, and it's just waiting for other people essentially to have the tripwire, which is a kind of false dilemma, foisted onto the source of the narcissistic supply, which is like uh, uh, the patriarchy, or it's going to be an external locus of control. It's going to be a scapegoat, and it's going to be sort of compelled to answer some false dilemma. That, well, white privilege is the false dilemma, because either you agree that white privilege is an insidious conspiracy that is perpetrating systemic oppression and that it's undeserved, or that you are claiming that white people are superior. And so you're saying, well, it's either the one or the other. It can't be anything else. So through that false dilemma, it can essentially force an extraction of narcissistic supply. Um, because essentially, if you are essentially, because according to that false dilemma, um, either it's a moral accusation, it's a moral claim that you don't have moral standing if you stand and do anything in favor of defending white privilege, or if you claim that no, it's because white people are superior, then well, if you have that claim, then you are actually a bad guy, and therefore it's good for me to extract a kind of sadistically edged uh, takedown and redistribution of what you have. So it's this kind of I mean, it's quite a convoluted ideological machination, but that kind of false dilemma is what borderlines are constantly manufacturing in their manipulation of their subconscious host, in their codependent sort of parasitism of somebody else's ego function. So it's like they just want to give their subjective feelings, and somebody else has to essentially precipitate the dilemma that the borderline is sort of describing, and then they have to kind of uh, surmount that toxic dilemma. And so all the borderline has to do is craftily, kind of cunningly precipitate these horrible dilemmas, um, and essentially not and then what kind of shows them to be kind of psychopathic, I think, overtly, is that when you actually dismantle the dilemma, if you actually start to deconstruct the dilemma as just being as an invention, as a kind of autistic invention that they have just asserted into being, that they have, and then they'll constantly try to say, well, I've been operating under these auspices, and they'll often try to make claims, well, no, you induced me into believing these sets of conditions. So essentially, the dilemma might not be real, but it's real enough, and you're responsible for me operating under this dilemma. So you still have to solve it. It doesn't matter if it's real or not. And that's the kind of uh, alloplastic strategy which essentially has, if and if you go too much into not playing along with their drama, then they will unlock all the very sort of seriously unhinged alloplastic defenses, where they will, basically go through a session of psychosis essentially, because you have dismantled their operational, their operating necessary, kind of conditions. Um, because what you have to understand is that when they're displaying that kind of psychosis, it's essentially their own. It's a kind of unspoken meta uh, declaration that they will not live without an external locus of control, and they will not be held uh, as having a kind of individual integrity. That they're not interested in curating and developing accountability uh, for their reality. They don't want to. They would rather have an unstable reality and an external locus of control than having to actually muster the work of essentially sentience. So these are people that are basically holding people hostage because of their unwillingness, essentially, to exercise their own sentience. I mean, they are still actually sentient, because essentially electing to uh, derogate uh, their own sentience is still an exercise of sentience. The problem is that that maneuver is essentially never underscored. It's never focused on by essentially enabling the cult essentially of sympathy, which this personality disorder is very good at tapping into, a kind of collective sympathy into essentially reifying its operating instruments as being just natural, as being a kind of a naturally occurring and automatic feature of their psychology, which they can't be held responsible for, and therefore essentially you have psychology enabling, uh, um, just in the same way that ideologically you get such a high level of kind of convolution within the ideology that then people just um, concede. That they just say, well, obviously it's going to be too much to get you to not mediate your life via your identity. You need to live in this narrative. You're too far gone. Your intellect is too rotten, essentially. And so, and this is quite obviously scary, because now a whole generation has been inculcated into these very disgusting fascistic values of mediating one's self-esteem via an identity that is described and regulated by an ideological narrative. So you've got a whole generation, maybe not Generation Z, but I think the one, which one was just before Generation Z, must Generation Y. I think Generation Y is probably the most fascistic generation. They have, it's just been bred into them. Um, which is a huge contrast to Generation X, I would say. I mean, obviously, I'm generalizing to some degree, but maybe some of the X's in the tail end sort of joined with Generation Y. Um, but I think to a large extent, Generation X actually understood non-racialism and non-sexism and equality, um, and then essentially the semantic sophistry and the weird kind of indoctrination started happening. And essentially I mean, I think it has to do with the quality of children's, sort of entertainment. That in the 90s you had the gummy bears, you had uh, you had uh, Star Trek Voyager, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, um, Star Trek The Next Generation. And you don't have that quality of morality anymore where people are regarded as individuals. I mean, there's something that I noticed growing up. I mean, obviously, I didn't watch shows that were essentially made for girls, but I remember noticing that, at least in my generation, uh, even, that a large section of the female population, I believe, was poisoned. I'm not sure if they were already poisoned, just because a certain section of the female population generally are inducted into that kind of cultural set of conventions. But the Care Bears were probably the most insidious form of propaganda, essentially, for identity politics. I think that you can see a kind of a proto identity politics, uh, uh, that was something that women were very into. But I mean, basically, I mean, I remember arguing with children in my pre-primary sort of school, um, that had already been corrupted and bitten by the bug, essentially, of that kind of stereotyped thinking, of that very depraved kind of denigration of the individual into a kind of ideological narrative of identity. Um, and I even watched some of the Care Bear shows, and I could just see how thick that corrupt morality was baked into it. But I remember thinking as well that it might not be so much a function of it might be simply because of person. Because I mean, I also knew some boys that were into that, but it might also be essentially because they were intuitive feelers, that they were in socionics and in MBTI you would call them intuitive feelers. In socionics, I think that they basically correspond with the beta quadra. Um, that they have essentially it's very stable for them to relate to the world in a kind of with an ideological narrative. Um, it empowers their subjective emotional state, um, and so that might be something that might be somewhat. I mean, it might just so happen that individuals that have that kind of personality style um, just naturally produce this kind of the social toxicity. Um, and creating, kind of disgusting ideologies. But anyway, I mean, there are other, I think, very good cartoons as well. I'll maybe just mention them. But Cow and Chicken, I believe, is very much like Charlie Brown on steroids. You can understand that. I mean, Cow and Chicken was really about deconstructing gender relations, and it had quite the same treatment of authority that Charlie Brown had. All the parents in Cow and Chicken were just kind of were just legs, and they were, kind of frivolous and crazy, and it was a very instructive cartoon because you you had to really come up with the lesson of the show yourself. You were just presented with a series of plot, and the characters working through the plot. Um, Very morally edifying. But just to go into the issue of gender, so I mean, cow and chicken. I mean, because what are you not supposed to be when you're a boy? You're not supposed to be a chicken. And what are you not supposed to be as a woman, or a girl, rather? You're not supposed to be a cow. And so cow and chicken was really trying to boil things down to a kind of individual uh, new a neutering of issues of self-esteem, and extracting self-esteem from a kind of superficial embodiment, and to sort of distill a deeper characterological, sort of moral truth. Um, Johnny Bravo had the same kind of paradox, that uh, it had very similar sort of themes. Although, I mean, that was also kind of a kind of cultural sort of prophecy in some sense, that men would have to actually develop a very independent internal locus of control in order to withstand essentially the very vile form of sort of toxic feminism, which which they were up against in terms of judging them superficially. Because, I mean, the moral of the story in Johnny Bravo is that he's not a bad guy, but because he's a bodybuilder, he is sort of it's just assumed that he's not a good person, uh, and essentially the kind of the superficialness in which um, the relation between the genders essentially um, uh, create a kind of an insulated sort of reality tunnel. Uh, Again, it doesn't actually give you the moral of the story in the actual plot. You have to kind of, it comes from a commentary, it comes from viewing it, it comes from metacogniting. It doesn't tell you what the moral of the story is. And that kind of children's entertainment doesn't exist anymore. Um, Pretty much. You don't have the same quality of intellect behind the creation, especially as Generation Y has now come to fill these positions, and because essentially they live in an ideological cartoon, and it's such a delicate and brittle sort of formula of interpreting reality, that the only thing that they can produce is propaganda, essentially. Um, and it's obnoxious. It's hard to watch. It's unsettling. Their entertainment that they produce is, it reminds me of essentially what must have gone on in Nazi Germany, in terms of the kind of instruction that was, um, no doubt, plastered onto the children. I know, um, I met someone at a Holocaust museum who lived through Nazi Germany as a child, and he complained about how pathetic the culture was, and how stupid everyone was, and how they believed the propaganda, and how stupid his parents were, and essentially how you had to kind of just put your head down and go along with it, because it was just um, sort of so noxious, but it was stultifying. It was an impoverishment of the soul, that you knew that you were being molded into a kind of cookie cutter sort of zealot, which obviously this individual uh, internally knew that it was depraved and that it was hollow, but he was not able to uh, well, in some sense, it's kind of like, when there's lots of potential above you, but you're not able to access it. You're not allowed to think in terms of that latitude, um, and you can't talk about essentially how your mind is being. I mean, you can't openly talk about it, but I mean, you're constantly aware of that internally, and so he was always a kind of seething malcontent in Nazi Germany, watching people get more and more stupid. That was his general sort of takeaway. But what was also very interesting was, I mean, he this was in the I think this was in the 2000s, and he was saying how the culture was very similar to the culture that we're experiencing, and how essentially he made it a very stark point that the Nazi movement, the cultural movement, was not how people think it is. It wasn't regimented. It was very much like the progressives. It was the same cultural ethos as the progressives. It was that same strange. That there are a lot of even transgender type people imagining, because essentially the idea of systemic oppression, there was a proto-fascism which Hitler even talks about as being cultivated. That essentially, that you get people to essentially help your movement, not by believing in the same thing that you believe, but by believing in the same formula. And so they were basically that they are. I, I talk about this when I talk about proto-fascism, but essentially there is a proto-fascism, and then there's the kind of the 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 slimmed down sort of a single identity, that you can, because I mean the truth is that identity politics is such a unwieldy, destructive ideology that it will it will destroy itself if it doesn't center around a single identity. If it doesn't have only one identity, it cannot succeed. There is no formula of proto-fascism that can actually have intelligent government behind it, because there are too many claims. It can't satisfy. The scapegoat only has so much blood that can be parasitically extracted. There's only so much redistribution that you can imagine from a single scapegoat, and so it doesn't function. Also, because all the identities have counterclaims against each other, and they have an oversubscription of the scapegoat. So I mean, the ideology just doesn't even function. Even if you have one identity and one scapegoat, it doesn't function. Or one identity and multiple scapegoats. It doesn't function on any level, but it functions even less so if you have multiple identities. And so it becomes like a kind of a PR stunt. It becomes a kind of, it becomes a very, it becomes a narrative. And, the Nazis suffered quite badly from the non-fulfillment of the narrative, because this is where Hitler always had to kind of try to say things nice about the poor Aryans, that, oh, they're still Aryan or something like that, who didn't essentially receive any real benefit from the radical revolution. That essentially it's a hollow shell. It's a hollow mythology, and it doesn't empower the individual. It only empowers the identity, and therefore only tokens and politically connected, sort of associates with the people at the highest level. So it's a very hollow elitist, kind of corrupt morality. It also has all this strange mysticism baked into it, that it kind of believes in a kind of mystical luck, because even if you believe in the cause of the identity, who are you in relation to that identity? And there's a kind of pecking order that's part of it. There's a very sort of regimented kind of picture of this uh, cultural totalitarianism. It's very caste. It has multiple classes within it, in terms of its ideological virtue, and that status seeking is the kind of status seeking that you see with borderlines that are always trying to attach themselves to the right consort, to the right host that is going to facilitate the maximization of their social standing or of good things. You know, they have a kind of insatiable greed, and they are as promiscuous and as sort of, you know, they're always on the lookout for how they can trade up, essentially. Um, I mean, obviously within reason, because there are some sort of hard limits, because they have to kind of, at some point, they have to calculate if they have the the possibility of being fated for a better position. You know, so they're kind of, uh, I mean, you can see this in politics as well. You know, in terms of how, you know, you never hear about these scandals when they happen. You hear about them when it's politically advantageous for some female that is now associated to somebody else's campaign. Then they'll release a story about another one of the candidates. You know, it's like, it's that kind of opportunism. It's that kind of very cynical, um, you know, somehow it's, you know, you'll never complain about something when it's happening, but then you'll complain about it when it's somehow politically advantageous. You know, it's I mean, this gets into this issue of integrity. You see, you can't sort of. This is why the ideology does not derive or have a way of developing real integrity. It just has a way of kind of aggregating this fake self-esteem that comes via the identity, and it never gets delivered. It never succeeds at actually generating, because the only thing that would actually generate real consistent self-esteem would be self-confidence, but you're not allowed to get self-confidence because the self-confidence is an individual thing. It doesn't come from your identity. And so the kind of the fundamentally poisonous wiring of the ideological narrative means that it cannot actually solve its own complaint. It cannot solve its own problem, and therefore, uh, well, I mean, it never wanted to anyway, because it's very comfortable having an external locus of control that it can always divert accountability onto, and then all it has to do is tell a story about its subjective feelings, and then somebody else has to kind of solve the dilemma that's baked into the story. So all you have to do is focus on telling subjective stories that have a kind of surreptitious dilemma baked into them, and essentially that's your hybridized borderline personality disorder in terms of identity politics, where your self-esteem is regulated by an identity which is described by an ideological narrative. And so the ideological narrative is your source of narcissistic supply, which the problem with narcissistic supply is that it doesn't ever uh, it doesn't ever sort of land. It doesn't uh, get delivered. And in some sense, the only way to believe that it got delivered is by in watching it being taken from the other person, watch it violently in some sense. And so, in some sense, that's when the fascism gets nasty. When they basically say, well, the reason why the ideology isn't working is because we're not violent with our enemy, and if we're not, because essentially, so they first get it off by, because essentially you can always describe whatever's going wrong in your life, you can describe it as a deficiency in self-esteem. So you can say, well, the reason why things are not good is because you don't have the self-esteem that belongs to your identity. uh, the identity has been cheated, it's been stolen from. So if we undo how the identity has been cheated, then you'll have the self-esteem that you're lacking. And then eventually, even though they do that solution and it doesn't work, well, it's the problem is that we haven't we haven't actually blamed the people who did this to us in the first place. That's why you're not getting your self-esteem. So we actually have to destroy the enemy. We have to make them actually bleed. We have to actually treat them properly like a scapegoat. Otherwise, that's why we're not seeing any improvement. And so it becomes quite overtly a kind of parasitic thing. Borderlines, they conceal this parasitism uh, quite well most of the time when things are functioning as they should, when the narrative is functioning as they should. But when they start being treated by their host to a kind of discussion which actually says, no, no, stop telling me your feelings. I don't want to hear about your feelings. Think about this for a second. Think about this for a second. Let's think about this logically. Let's think about this reasonably and coherently. Let's try and create a syllogism about this. Let's do some decent rationalization. Let's see if this works in some kind of self-consistent, sort of formula of where we're going to get to, and or whatever. Like let's make a real plan. Let's design something that actually is designed to work, that isn't feeling centric, but it's based on being pragmatic. If they are spoken to in that tone, they have to basically jettison. They have to disrupt. They have to violently kind of throw the chessboard over to start again, because there are no winning moves on that basis. They have to kind of, um, and sometimes borderlines, if they don't have someone in their field of vision that they're targeting to be their subconscious host, um, they will just go on a rampage preemptively in some sense, because they're trying to broadcast via their chaos. They're trying to broadcast, look how chaotic I am. I need to attract someone who is going to impose order, because as soon as they find someone that's going to impose order and reason onto them, then they can play their drama, they can play their cat and mouse game, they can try to embroil them into taking an external locus of control in relation to their state. They're trying to essentially attract a paternalist caregiver or something like that. They're trying to attract a kind of a parental surrogate. Um, and they have very high standards, and it's often the case that they can't even find someone that matches with the standard of care that they want to be pandered to. And so, in that meantime, they're also okay with just being, malevolent. And look, borderline often does not end up with what it aimed. Usually they run out of um, opportunities at some point, and then sort of reality hits them at some point, and then they just kind of become uh, bitter failures at their borderline circus. But their values never change. They never reorientate their. So then maybe they'll create a second fiddle. They'll come up with a kind of consolation strategy, perhaps, where they still try to have the hope that they can ensnare someone into fulfilling that external locus of control. Um, I mean, it gets much more perverted than that, because if I mean, I just described how someone would essentially threaten their operating strategies, but what if they don't get their operating strategies threatened, and they actually get to lure someone into their den, into their strategy sort of operating center, what they eventually do is they completely do an inversion, where what I call the House of Mirrors, where they have this kind of smoke filled house of mirrors, and they use the other person as a complete proxy for their own responsibility. So essentially, everything that they don't like about themselves, they project onto the other person, and everything that they like about the other person, they abrogate to themselves. They switch places, and they condition the other person essentially to believe in whatever they say. So essentially, they don't want to hear what the other person's emotions are. They speak for everyone's emotions. They have the voice of emotion of the emotional state of the codependent unit. And so eventually what they end up doing is they actually treat the other person as if they are borderline. It's quite insidious, but they end up concentrating all the problematic elements of borderline, and they say, actually, you did this, you orchestrate this borderline thing, it's all you, and I'm trying to react to your pathology. And they play this, they actually kind of uh, because they've spent so long modeling their target, their host, their prey, that they have it within themselves a model of what it is like to react to their own pathology. And so they sometimes also like to embody that, but they can only do that in the safety of the sanctum of the House of Mirrors. And it takes them a long time to set up the House of Mirrors because they have to decompartmentalize their host. They have to break down the emotional body of their host until it becomes just a husk of that they just want the other person's analytical. Uh, they just want the other person to analytically tend to their feelings, and so they don't want them to have any feelings of their own. And so once they get the other person broken down to the state where they speak for the other person's feelings, then they make that other person however they want, they dress them however they want them to, and they usually use indictments, they usually use kind of moral accusations and morally charged, they're always breaking down the integrity of their host. And you can see this in white privilege, because essentially if you're leveraging dilemmas against people, the dilemmas are hard, and they're poisonous, and they are usually based on confections and lies and distortions. So the only way to get someone to constantly have to process your dilemmas and to take the burden of processing the dilemmas is to make them somehow culpable on a meta level for having to deal with this. They have to kind of invent, you know, cultural conventions about the evilness of the identity, you know, just to ground it. You know, the House of Mirrors needs a dogma to safeguard that level of that end game that the borderline wants. And you can see this happening on the level of fascism and the level of identity politics. The same process is at work. Yeah, so I mean, sadly, this is so complicated, but you know, if culture doesn't get to the point where it understands that a significant section of the female population is prone to developing these kinds of dependencies on cultural identities and conventions, if it's not capable of seeing that some women essentially don't operate individual integrity, that they operate a kind of ideological narrative description of integrity which they feel entitled to and which they leverage in a very kind of toxic game. If we don't get to that point, we can't actually have, you know, we do have to have firewalls, you know, we do have to set up roadblocks to stop essentially the destruction of civilization. And you know, it just is a fact that this has come from feminism, that identity politics and intersectionality were both children of feminism. And if we don't understand essentially the exploitative culture that this wave of feminism is premised in, that how it is hypocritically unegalitarian, it's not interested in accountability and ownership um, of this cultural part of the puzzle. And if we don't sort of surmount, I mean, I was going to say as well that essentially the end of the patriarchy happened culturally, I think, around the 30s and the 40s. I'm not a historian, but I believe that that was when basically people stopped just giving their inheritances to male heirs, and they basically said, well, actually, we like our daughter more than we like our son, so we'll just give the daughter the inheritance. Where basically they said, well, actually, we think our daughter is a better person than our son is. But whereas before it was kind of more regimented, that and I think that ever since that shift, that cultural shift, which has now taken a long time to kind of unfold, uh, if we don't get to grips with, let's say, the reason why there was traditional um, stark division in gender uh, power relations, if we don't look at that honestly, we are going to destroy society and civilization, or we're going to become fascist, having to acclimatize to essentially a form of cultural exploitation. Just because we can't say that women have been perpetrators, they're not just innocent victims. They aren't just naive. That they, that their willingness to sort of disempower themselves and to play this kind of sacred victim is is a self-fueling complaint, and it is such a and people are so acclimatized to ceding way and to just sort of forgiving women their kind of their cultural exploitation, that people just take it. But essentially, there is a fallout to that. I think that the problem with gender relations, or whatever you want to call it, is essentially this insidious matriarchy that has to be identified. Uh, and I mean, it is slightly problematic because I do think that on some level, women will need to be more sophisticated and more intelligent than the average man in order, um, I guess, oh, maybe men will also have to be more intelligent because they'll have to actually have to uh, not become these kinds of ideological pedants of the narrative being woven by women, by that kind of being spellbound by some kind of narrative of a supplementary form of integrity, which has this corrosive, dual-edged, kind of, you can exploit culture, but it comes at a cost. But you can't just complain about the cost. You also actually have to take ownership of the cultural exploitation. Uh, and it's this two-faced inconsistency within so-called feminism, which is really the what has propounded this, what is now a kind of a very flagrant fascistic form of parasitic self-esteem. But yeah, it does give us a window into. I mean, it gives us a larger scope to see the problem in feminism. Um, at least it gives us that. And so hopefully we will be able to surmount this culturally. We'll be able to come to a kind of watershed. Um, and the problem is, and I can still see that this is the problem, is that we're going to have to acclimatize ourselves to being able to label women just as we label men as having low integrity, of being bad people. This is the problem, is that the sacred cow that women culturally leverage about their own sort of innate virtue is is something that has to be dissolved. That is really the crux of what is holding us back from having a real cultural novation. Um, and some people already operate on this level because you can, as an individual, you can already operate on this individualistic level. But it's I guess you call them unicorns. The, there are unicorn females out there, um, but there are too few of them, essentially. Anyway.